Namashri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Sure Satchit Sukha Swarupaya Swami Tapaharine. Hello everybody. We are here with another episode of Be with a Beacon, a series where we meet prominent personalities across the globe. We have had persons like Seema Modak, YB Thapa, Lapadyang CM, who made Meghalians proud. On the other hand, we have had Jeffrey Long, Swami Kripakarananda, who are admired for their eminence in their respective fields, who continue to inspire individuals, youth in particular. Today, we are fortunate to have amongst us someone who is a senior research fellow at All Souls College and a professor of modern history at the University of Oxford. She has been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship for Research in French History and the Wolfson History Prize for her work. In 2011, she was elected a Fellow for the British Academy, the UK's National Academy for the Humanities and the Social Sciences. She has published widely in the history of science and medicine, the history of gender and religion, and the history of politics and emotion. I'm talking about Professor Ruth Harris. She wrote the book Guru to the World, Life and Legacy of Vivekananda from Harvard University Press. We welcome you, Professor Ruth Harris.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be able to speak to people in your part of India.
Oh, that's wonderful on our part as well. And let me tell you, viewers, it's not just another book on Vivekananda. It encompasses the relevance of Swami Vivekananda's philosophy from various viewpoints in the most engaging manner. So we shall know more from her. So, Professor Harris, you must have answered this question a number of times, but every time the answer is always very engaging. How did you come across this subject? As in, when we look at your career and we see the kind of work, the kind of research that you have done so far was completely different. You've written on the psychology of murder and many other things. And as if this book, Guru to the World, seems to be a paradigm shift. How did it happen? Why Swami Vivekananda?
Well, there are two things. On one level, it was a shift, and it was a tremendous shift, and it meant that I had to spend between 8 and 10 years doing the book because I had no background. On another level, it wasn't, because I came to it through French history. I was reading on the relationship between Romain Rolland, a famous French pacifist and intellectual who had opposed the bloodshed of World War I, and who had a fantasy that Gandhi would come to Europe and he would stop the carnage that he knew fascism would bring. Of course, Gandhi did come and visit him, but he didn't agree to lead the anti-fascist struggle in Europe. But in the process of reading Romain's discussion of Gandhi, I picked up the other two books he wrote, one on Ramakrishna, which is very famous in the West, and the other on Vivekananda. And it's been that book that got me started on why and how Westerners received the message of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. And then the second reason, which in some ways was even more important, was that I was thinking about writing a book on Albert Schweitzer and missionaries. Again, their impact on the wider world. And I began to think, well, this isn't so interesting anymore. We all know about this. But what did interest me was the relationship of people like Vivekananda as they came from the colonial and imperial world to the West, and how they shaped our views and how they shifted our perceptions, and why it was that somebody like Vivekananda had such an impact outside of India before he returned to India. And that's how I began. And of course, I began to read the letters and I got a sense of him as a human being. And that was, of course, very enticing.
And tell me something in the beginning when you read him, which really struck you, and which you felt that's amazing, and it's quite different. I mean, the entire gamut of his philosophy is one thing, and but then in the beginning, that's that one point that strikes you, and you feel that yes, this is something different and something I like.
What struck me about him was his capacity to express um, through wit and humor very harsh, sometimes fundamental truths, especially to his Western audience. And at the same time, his openness to their preoccupations. And I was stunned by this because he could have been very angry. And there were moments when he was cross, even at the parliament. There were times when he said, please, don't speak of us as heathens. Don't offer us stones when we need food. He would be angry. But it was also his, what I thought was his cultural ambidexterity, the idea that he knew so much about Indian thought, Hindu ideas, and had been an apprentice of Ramakrishna. But at the same time, he was able to engage in any of the discussions that the Westerners were interested in. And that was what struck me, as well as the first women who dealt with him. He could talk about Darwin, he could talk about Spencer, he could talk about Tyndall, who was a polemicist, a scientific polemicist. And he could talk about the lake poets, he could talk about many things. And everything was, and I began to think, what does it mean for somebody like this to have to be both things, to so many different people, that he had to encompass all this learning and ability to communicate. And at the same time, it was both a sign of his of colonialism that he had to learn all this stuff, but at the same time, an opportunity for him to go around the world and make people think about Indian religion and India differently, in a new context.
Ah, I have a question. I mean, I desperately feel like asking that, but then here is another one. Somebody who's viewing, Mr. Gautam De. Gautam De wants to know which letter of Swami Vivekananda had impressed you the most, or maybe in the beginning.
Um, I'll tell you, the letter that impressed me the most was when he writes to Nivedita, and he
Mm-hmm.
explains that he sees everyone, all his followers, giving him all his love. And yet he has to treat everyone the same because otherwise there will be squabbles. But it does not mean that he's a brute and doesn't understand the importance of devotion and love in the guru disciple relationship, and that what it means to individuals and also what it means to him. And one of the things is, of course, he also recognized that he had personal love and that it was hard to be a guru. This was the thing I loved about Swami Vivekananda, was that he acknowledged the difficulties. He wasn't trying to be, he knew that he wasn't a Ramakrishna. Um, he constantly said he wasn't even trying to be a Mahatma. He was
Mm-hmm.
trying, he acknowledged he was himself with all his failings. And it was that human dimension of recognition and self-recognition of others and of himself that inspired me.
That's wonderful. And many a time, yes, we are so humbled by his approach when he says that I am nobody in front of Sri Ramakrishna, but we know what he was. Yes, I felt like I was too tempted to ask you this question because a chapter that impressed me of all things in your book was the chapter of Sri Ramakrishna, and I thought she could write one on him as well. So Did you consider writing it, or in the course of your research, the project, the journey, when you read about Ramakrishna extensively through Kathamrita, as it appears in your bibliography, did you feel like that, okay, let me write on the guru of Vivekananda?
Well, I have to say, of all the things I wrote, that was the most difficult. I mean, how does anyone put into words Ramakrishna? I mean, and you can imagine, as a Westerner, not brought up in this tradition, I had read the Gospel of Ramakrishna, which is not the same as the Kathamrita. I then went ahead, and there is now a very, very good word by word translation. I read the 5 volumes, and I began to think of how difficult it is to convey the message of Ramakrishna, to as well as trying to understand how we get that message only through secondhand, through devotees who were also completely changed by his presence. We get an extraordinary sense of his charisma and his humanity, as well as his capacity to really touch people of different psychological makeups. And the story of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda is often told as a story of opposites. But what moved me in that story is its superficial opposites. Certainly, Ramakrishna comes across as a bhakti, and Vivekananda as a skeptical jnani. But underneath, it was Ramakrishna's wisdom that he was learning, Vivekananda was learning. And Vivekananda himself said, underneath, I am a bhakta. And so it is a very complex relationship, and one that's transformational. And I couldn't help but think how important it is that Ramakrishna realizes that he needs somebody who is not like him, that there is a new world, not just the world of Dakshineshwar, but the world of India and also the wider world. And he understands that he needs somebody who can communicate in that wider world. And that's, again, the savviness of somebody like Ramakrishna that really impressed me. And finally, I find the way he insisted on being a baby. And we know, of course, he wasn't a baby, Ramakrishna, but the way he inverted everything and said that it's the innocence and the play of babyhood before society, before religion, taught religion. That innocence is what is the authentic, in quotations, Atman. And he acknowledges Vivekananda's intelligence. But when he reasons too much, he says, your reasoning, I don't like it. And he says to him, you must go beyond that. And this is something that in America in particular, he used all the time when he was speaking to his audiences. It wasn't just the rational Vivekananda that they loved.
uh, yeah, the rational Vivekananda, but he had to impress the rational, the intellectual lot in America, and that's what is found in your book. So, what thoughts actually made you think that the concept of Swami Vivekananda and America needs a new light, and you must start from a new slate? uh, with the fact that there are already so much written and so many books on Swami Vivekananda, and many of them have actually focused on Swami Vivekananda and America. But you thought that no, something still, uh, probably some links are missing, or I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, I did very much. I mean, I was surprised at how much there was to say. Um, I have to say there was a personal dimension here in a weird way. It brought many things together for me. Of course, I am American. You can hear from my accent. I'm not British. I ended up in Britain, and I married an Englishman. Um, so, and also in Oxford, we have many South Asians, and these were people I had never met, and it was interesting that working on Vivekananda brought, strangely, my American, my British, uh, and my Indian friends all together. And what I was interested in learning was, most of my American friends said, was we were growing up, oh, we're not religious, but we're spiritual. And I thought, where does that come from? How could they feel so detached? Most of them, many of them were Jewish, many of them were Christian, but they all think of themselves as spiritual. And yet they knew on some level that many of the ideas around the spirituality that they professed came from some vision of yoga or India, but they had no idea of its history, nor did they understand that Vivekananda comes not just as a teacher, but also to explain why colonialism is wrong. He also wants people to understand that they must learn the techniques he's teaching so that they can be less brutal, more mild, more meditative, more spiritual. And so I set out with that mission to try and understand. And in the course of it, I realized that what people had not grasped was the connection between him and William James, who's one of the great, who is considered in America to be basically the founder of psychology. Even Europeans acknowledge that he's, in a sense, the first American global intellectual. If you read Romain Rolland and his discussion of Vivekananda, he writes about William James, and he says, "My God," and he's a haughty French intellectual. He thinks he knows everything. And he reads William James and he says, "My God, this is good. He's an American, but it's really good." And he recognizes that Vivekananda is part of a much greater shift in views of the self, consciousness, and religious experience. And I read his work on religious experience, and I read some of his correspondence, and you realize that he was having, in footnotes and in a way, a debate with Vivekananda. I mean, that, there is a real discussion of major figures here. He does not accept Hinduism. When he meets Sister Nivedita, he sees that she's Hinduized herself, and he thinks of her as very, very lucky that she's found this. But he thinks Hinduism, he still thinks Hinduism, he calls it a sumptuosity of security. He still thinks of it in very Orientalist terms as metaphysical and transcendent, but not based in science the way he thought it was. And it's very interesting to see this debate because it's a very important one. And that was what made me think. The other thing about America, everyone knows that Vivekananda's key followers were, acolytes in America were women. But the whole importance of what they create together, American women, and what he creates with Nivedita, or Nivedita, depending how you pronounce it, is a joint creation. And this vision of Vivekananda is not what people usually think. They think of him as one of the great men. Well, I wanted to put him into the role of as a global thinker, but at the same time to acknowledge that he acknowledged that without the women who were his, in a sense, co-creators, not just his helpers,
Co-creators, exactly.
co-creators. And of course, and also without Margaret Noble and Sister Nivedita, he would not have become known around the world. I mean, she hooks his ideas, hence why the last 3 chapters are on her, because she connects him and his world to the imperial networks much more securely than he was able to. We have to remember Vivekananda dies young. He's only 39. And he needs people to carry his message.
Legacy.
When Romain Rolland writes his book on Vivekananda, he's got all the material from Josephine MacLeod. That's the woman. He makes fun of her. He calls her a dilettante, but he completely underestimates her. She's hit the right man. She knows who to give the information to. Do you see what I'm saying? And so it's through him that Romain Rolland that many people got to know Gandhi, let alone Vivekananda and Ramakrishna. You see what I mean? And it's also through Romain Rolland that Freud and he have a discussion of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. So it's very important to understand how these ideas connected. And it's not just America, but it is also Europe as well. And that is what I sought to show. So it's at a very elite level, but also at the ground level. And it's also by understanding these women and why it was that women who should have been missionaries, because they look, Nivedita at times, she acts and talks like a missionary, become fierce anti-imperialists, Remember,
Indeed, the course of her life
yes, Nivedita
shifts.
she works with Aurobindo at the end.
Mm.
And this is extraordinary. These people did not they took a different route because of their connection to Vivekananda.
Yeah, I am tempted to ask this connection of Gandhi and other things. But then here is one question from Professor Ayun Bhattacharjee, and he asks, I find it intriguing that you present and understand Indian ethos so delicately in this book. How challenging was that, considering that you were not brought up in Indian tradition? And you just mentioned it, but then maybe he wants a bit more elaboration.
Professor, I can't tell you. In the fourth year, I began to despair. I could not get it. I was working and working, and I thought to myself, oh, this time I've bitten off too much. This time I'm going to get into trouble. That's what I thought
Why so?
because I could not understand, and of course, no one understands Advaita Vedanta. But I was working so hard. And I had, as I said, I was raised in a Jewish tradition, very monotheistic, um, a personal God. Then I wrote a book on the miracles and apparitions at Lourdes. So I spent a year working on Catholicism, which was already just to learn about the Virgin Mary and healing. And I thought even this was very hard. But when I approached the Indian ideas, I thought, whoa, this is different. And I think the change came when I listened to a very good translation of the Gita. And when I
Which
heard,
was it?
I can't remember, I'm sorry, but it was a wonderful, I mean, that whole thing of Arjuna on the battlefield and then the advice from Krishna. And for me, it was all so counterintuitive, despite the fact that I'd learned about Kant and the categorical imperative. But it was, when you begin to understand, having my Indian friends, what it is for him, Arjuna, not to defend his family and his relations because of his dharma, when Indian families mean so much. I mean, the sacrifice is so extraordinary for the higher ethos that I began to appreciate it. And I had some very remarkable colleagues in Oxford who didn't mind my constant questioning. And what's interesting is that they were secular, many of them, but they began to recognize that we really can't understand the politics and the ethos of the Indian anti-colonial struggle without religion. And since I had been working on religion and science for many years, they found what I was doing on Vivekananda, very different. And they were questioning me. And it was in those exchanges that I began to get an idea. And I tried, as you say, to be delicate. I'm not sure I always managed, but you must not reduce any of these traditions. And I know that being of Jewish origin myself, that people, in the past, anti Semitism has reduced Judaism, completely misunderstood much of its teachings. And when I worked on Lourdes, I tried to understand a very different culture from my own and why people felt that they had been healed through the help of the Virgin. So these were, I tried to use my historical imagination to enter into the world I'm looking at. And I realized that people pick and choose from Vivekananda. But the fact is, the world he lived in was a little bit like ours, but it really isn't. I mean, we have to understand this is a world of theosophy, of spiritualism, of Christian science. It's a world where people are reading Max Muller's Sacred Books of the East. These are people who they come out of a tradition in America of transcendentalism, so they have some strange idea of what Indian thought is, and you have to understand that world. And it's not the same as ours, but you also have to respect it because you can't understand how the women created things with him otherwise, because they're talking constantly. And he is amazing because he can listen, he absorbs very quickly, but also he listens, and he doesn't make fun. Occasionally, he's teasing in his letters in private because he thinks that many of their understandings are immature compared to Indian thought. But he listens and he's open. And that is what, again, was unusual about him.
Ah, wonderful. Just now you have mentioned Christian Science.
Yes.
Uh, in one of your chapters, you have dealt very elaborately the chapter which let me read through it. The transcendence, that chapter.
Yeah.
So, what do you mean by this Christian Science?
Well, that's extraordinary. That's what they called it. And
Okay.
it's a woman named Mary Baker Eddy. And she says she discovers, that's her notion of science, that the illusion of bodies, egos being in different bodies. And she insisted that the king, we didn't have to wait for the kingdom of God, but that it could come right away. And when Vivekananda first encountered them, he called them Vedantins. It was very interesting.
Oh.
Yes, he
Mm.
said they have a notion of what Vedanta is. And of course, he can only understand what they're doing through his spiritual lens, and they can only understand what he's doing through their spiritual lens. So it's an encounter. It's a very difficult encounter. And what happens is almost every single one of his close followers had experimented with Christian Science. And the reason why they leave Christian Science is because they find him more interesting, more intellectually satisfying, and also one of the things that Christian scientists tend to believe, uh, to look at mind control or mind thought through positive feelings and positive suggestion. Vivekananda, of course, was trying to teach them to love God in the terrible. It wasn't just positive, you know. Vivekananda talked about when he was closer to his very close disciples about not just the beauty of the world, but also the ugliness of the world and how to put those two together. And they found this very hard to understand, but they were attracted to it. And it was the thing that it was the hardest thing for the Christian audience to grasp, that you could, I mean, that he would keep on explaining fire is bad if it burns down your house, but fire is good if it helps you cook. I mean,
Indeed.
he
That's
would
very,
do,
very interesting.
yeah, like
And
Ramakrishna, he would go into the
somebody really can
parables.
understand
Yes, that is
Vivekananda through these contradictions.
through the
Uh,
contradictions, but also the thing that there's a cosmic perspective that we can't have, of course, and that we must understand, that we must love God in the terrible. And it was very
aren't
hard.
we putting it again to a mystical realm that we can't have or we can't understand?
Well, not
Something
in
that
this world
both
of
of you
Maya.
did.
Yes, not in this world of Maya. That's it. But yeah, so that's
That's
that's that's what they were trying to consider, and that's what I think they found it very extraordinary. But they also went to Christian Science because they wanted to realize themselves. They wanted to have less mental anguish, um, better physical health. And these were, and what Vivekananda said was, well, in Christian Science and in hypnotic therapy, you need operators, but it's the individual's journey. He didn't like the fact that there were outside people working on others, and instead, he had the guru disciple relationship, but he wanted them to learn the techniques of meditation and the perseverance of meditation and the search. And he didn't want them to concentrate on getting powers. He thought there was too much emphasis on ends, not means. And that's what they came to accept. But it was hard for them. It was hard for them to understand.
uh, let me come back to this question once again. In the chapter Magic, Science, and Transcendence that I was referring to, you have quoted Vivekananda and shown how science and religion can both be polemic. If so, then does science apparently surpass religion while disregarding supersensory experiences?
It's really I find Vivekananda on this fascinating. I think he was more astute than any most Western thinkers on this. When people spoke of the survival of the fittest, what we would call social Darwinism, and called it science, when they spoke about nations and races, he knew immediately that it wasn't science, that it was just scientific polemics. Do you see what I'm saying? And he would say, um, it wasn't that Vivekananda was not interested in science. You know about Vivekananda's dedication to science. He read in evolution. He knew things about embryology. He knew aspects. He read various things on thermodynamics and physics. I don't know how well. And of course, he was very impressed with Jagadish Bose, and that's why he urges Nivedita to work with him in biophysics. But at the same time, he really believed that science was a handmaiden to Vedanta, and that real science, that it would change aspects of how we viewed the world, but that it was not in itself a God better than God. And it was that insight, I think, again, that very much impressed his Western audiences, who were actually by this time, the 1890s, 1900, they'd had enough of the idea that, everything was determinism, everything was materialism. And the discussion about consciousness and superconsciousness, which often blended in ways that were helpful and unhelpful, was something that they were really interested in, as it was for somebody like William James. I mean, what William James said was mystical experience. He didn't say, I can prove it or not prove it. What he said was, what's important is the subjective understanding, the subjective experience that people have. And this was the bridge on which they had their discussion. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think so. But here there
It's
is
very
another
hard.
paragraph which I picked up, and I feel like reading it out. You wrote, Vivekananda fought against these notions by emphasizing a spirituality that embraced science. This is what you
That's right.
meant just now, while also refusing to separate science from religion.
That's
In
right.
his view, science was not a disruptive enlightenment legacy that broke the link between authority and knowledge. Now, my question will be, modern science and Vedanta often seem to converge in the writings of Vivekananda.
Yeah.
Again, he warns us about the superstitions present in religious practices as well as science. What is a single takeaway from these apparently contradictory ideas?
What he's saying is don't accept claims um, from either religion or science as blanket claims. You have to,
Hmm.
and also each individual must find his or her own path through this thicket of intellectual understanding. And that's what he says. And I think that's a very interesting idea. A lot of people would not agree with it. I mean, one of the things is about Vivekananda is people ask me, do you think Ramakrishna was unique? And I say, yes, of course he was unique, but there were other figures in Indian history. That's why they kept on thinking he was a reincarnation of Chaitanya. You know, there's others like Ramakrishna, you know, saints, holy gurus, avatars. But there's only one Vivekananda. He globalizes Hinduism, you know. He engages in these kinds of debates. Now, whether you agree with him or not is still up for debate, you know, but he's provocative. That's the point. At the time, the Orthodox didn't accept what he was doing. They fought him. And even today, there are those who disagree, especially with his vision of karma yoga, as you know, and his vision of the relationship of karma yoga to Advaita. They find it paradoxical and disconcerting. But also, those who, when he talked against don't touchism and all those other things, there are others who have rituals that they find that they do not want to give up, and they don't like that those polemics. And yet, he never said you had to give up anything, but he wanted people to question what it was they were doing, and he did prioritize Advaita uh, above other forms of, you know, image worship, though he always said that in his view, you could, Ramakrishna had achieved everything spiritually through Kali. And he was totally honest about that. There's a quotation in the book from there in that. So it's fascinating, isn't it, that he was so open.
So Swami Vivekananda was more unique in his approach than Sri Ramakrishna, because Sri Ramakrishna, you found many other figures which in the history,
But
which you found
it's not
similar
that
to
he
Sri
isn't
Ramakrishna.
unique. Of course, Ramakrishna is utterly unique. He's not like anybody I've ever encountered. We all know that he's remarkable. But what I'm saying is there are other extraordinary Hindu saints and mystics and, you know, that, you know, are in history. But no one, because of the change in times. I mean, Vivekananda becomes a global figure. He leaves, he goes to Chicago, he does all these things. He rethinks many aspects of Hindu practice and theology in a way, and he engages with debates that Ramakrishna could never engage with.
And why so, you think?
I think because of who he was. And this goes back to his Brahmo upbringing. And I think that he comes out of a tradition in his own home, despite his very religious mother, where he could, you know, he could have remained in Calcutta and been a successful lawyer like his father and become a Brahmo. But there's something else in him which leads him to Ramakrishna. Now, many people were going to Ramakrishna. Keshav Sen, who was a Brahmo, was inspired by Ramakrishna. But what happens is that his encounter with Ramakrishna over those 4 or 5 years, I can't remember exactly, he wants to see God. Vivekananda has this mystical sense, and he knows when he sees ultimately that with Ramakrishna, he can do that. He feels he can do that. And when he accepts Ramakrishna and when he accepts Kali, I think it's a spiritual reconciliation of the highest order. And I think that that's partially why he hopes to bring reconciliation when he goes to America. But he's also savvy. He needs to impress them, but he also acknowledges that there are dynamics of power that have to shift. And that's why he scolds the people in the West, the way he scolds people in India. He says, you're brutal, you're materialistic, you don't listen, you don't see yourselves. He does all of that. And then when he comes back to India, he says, you're timid, you're quarrelsome, you don't know how to, you must learn self-reliance and commit yourself to practical Vedanta. It's a very interesting way. Again, like a good guru, he says different things to different audiences. But despite that, I still don't think that there are two Vivekanandas. There are people who've said that it's two Vivekanandas. He does one thing in the West, and he does something else in India. I don't think that's the case. I think it's the same man, but he's pulled and pushed by this constant attempt to communicate, to use, the Buddha's message of skillful speech to try and get people to understand what they need. And I think that's why he's so tired and also ill, because by the end we would say,
He's
burnt out.
constantly struggling to.
And he's burnt out. I mean, it's hard for him. He says it's hard for him to be the so-called cyclonic monk. He says it's hard for him to observe the rules of Western punctuality. He often says he wishes he was back with Ramakrishna under the trees in Dakshineshwar. He has to shift his whole rhythm and psyche. And he asks the same of his monks. And it is a massive shift. It really is. And it's exhausting. And that's why his women friends in America, they worry about him all the time because they see he's exhausted and ill. And he's very ill. He's ill. And that's why his remarks on strength are so poignant, because he is weakening the whole time he's
So you
talking
think it's
about.
more of, I mean, of course he was physically ill, but it was mental strain and stress that he has to go through while breaking through the barriers and the superstitions that different people had with them.
Yes, I agree. I do think it was very exhausting. And I think that was one of the things that I found very moving again about the letters. I can't remember who he says it to. I think it's either to Margaret Noble or Sarah Bull. He says, he talks about his nervous body. And sometimes it plays beautiful music and sometimes not so much.
Not so much.
Yeah. And it's again that human capacity to acknowledge his weaknesses that I found, for me, it's that I found most attracted to him, that he wasn't a Superman, and that in not being a Superman, he's extraordinary.
These two words, not Superman and extraordinary. Well,
Exactly.
we
Because
have a question from.
yeah, that's exactly what he was constantly saying. He was saying, be one, he talks at times about the imitation of Christ, to be, he read that book. He loved this book, A Kempis's book. He
Yeah.
took it with him, with the Gita. And I think it's an extraordinary uh, relationship to this book, because he said what he couldn't believe was the Christian missionaries read in India didn't follow the example. This was a manual for a sannyasin in his view. And at the same time, later on, he said, imitation is good. You can imitate Christ, but be Christ, he says. Be better than Christ. So you see, this is it. He comes away from imitation. And also, he doesn't want the Indians to imitate the British. He wants them to be Indian. And that's the whole issue for him. How do you take in the world, the universal, while remaining authentically yourself? And that's the message for himself, for individuals, but also for nations. And that's again the paradox, the contradiction. I'm sorry you had a comment and I interrupted you. Sorry.
Yeah, here we are. This is Brahmachari Amala Chaitanya. He is a monk in Ramakrishna order, and he asks, how do you think Vivekananda's ideas about blending experience and reason are influencing the modern thought currents of the West in science, psychology, and philosophy?
Um, I think it's hard. As I said, the most important was the discussion between him and, well, not the discussion, but the implied discussion between him and William James. Um, they all were trying to blend experience and reason. And what I try to show is that Vivekananda is part of the discussion. And when people say in America, um, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, what they're trying to say is, I think, if you have a good vision of that, a nice, let's say a charitable or generous vision of that, what they're trying to say is, we're not superstitious. We don't belong to these old ideas. But we are open to many different paths. And many of them are also saying, like my friend who is the one who's most connected with us, she's a surgeon and a scientist, that they do not find any contradiction between her scientific vision of the world and her need for spiritual fulfillment. So that's what I think. And I think, again, if you understand through his disciples, he was interested in creating a Vedantic science. He himself was not able to do that, but he was interested in the idea that people would see the cosmic and the mundane together. So that's what I think.
Cosmic and the mundane together.
Yeah, it's again this thing about unities, that it's the constant refrain. And again, what they found so difficult, the constant, because they have the Enlightenment, they think the universal is European rationality. But when science comes to India, it doesn't shift. Um, People are interested in science, but many of them continue to have their spiritual preoccupations. In the West, the tendency was to feel that there had to be a split. And by the end of the 19th century, there's a greater revolt against these kinds of ideas in many different areas. And Vivekananda slots into those discussions because he acknowledges them. I mean, what's interesting about Vivekananda is he believes in evolution, but he doesn't believe that natural selection has a role in the higher mental and psychological and moral faculties. Everyone thinks that, oh, well, that's because he wasn't much of a scientist. But at the time, even Darwin's co-discoverer, Alfred Russel Wallace, would have agreed with Vivekananda. And there were many
Exactly.
scientists, yes, there were many scientists who did not agree with natural selection. It takes a long time for the mechanism of natural selection to be fully understood, and probably not until the 1920s, 1930s. And so there's a lot of debate about it. Remember, Vivekananda is coming into a world where Weissman's theory of the continuity of the gene plasm is just coming in. And that's what you have to understand. I mean, he goes to the zoo, I think it is in Calcutta, and he sees the animals and he says, Darwin may have been right about them, but I still don't think that we can understand what's going on without cause and effect, without karma. Do you see? For the moral and intellectual and ethical world.
Exercises. Yeah.
It's fascinating to think how he was in the zoo and that was what he was thinking about.
We would be busy watching the animals act.
That's not what I think when I go to the zoo, but it's very Vivekananda.
Ruth, there's a common trend these days to validate every religious practice. I mean, I'm using the word religious as a spiritual, religious, both taken together. So to validate it with science, this is very good because this is scientific. And these practices are scientific. I mean,
Mhm.
it's true for all the religion, and if one starts, the other also starts. Now, but we know that it is religion, or the spirituality for that matter, is more of experience. It's more of mm, uh, the super sensory experience. Whereas if you have to prove something through science, it's only these five senses that has to. You have to see, you have to smell, you have to you know what. So where is the stand of Vivekananda, and what do you think now? I mean, why we have to validate it through science? Or is it worth, is it necessary, even in modern times, that we validate a particular aspect of spirituality or religious practice with
I don't
science?
think he would
This.
say that it was necessary at all. And I also think he wouldn't. Vivekananda was very, he wanted people to find his or her own way, but he also didn't like what he saw as, how can I say it again, charitably. He, for example, when he was a Greenacre in Maine, observing the alternative spirituality, he would
Mhm.
tease Mary Hale and talk about how this one and that one was was promising to give through healing that was based, quote, in science, eyes to
Mhm.
the blind. And he would make fun of that. Do you see what I mean? He didn't think it was possible. He didn't think that real spirituality was just about the miraculous. And he encouraged people not to search for, quote, getting powers or being the miraculous. He thought that a more enduring spirituality was based on the perseverance of this and the disciplined search. And I think that um, he'd learned that from Ramakrishna, and that's why I begin that chapter by talking about how Ramakrishna has throat cancer, and his disciples want him to cure himself. And Ramakrishna says, I can't ask for that if I've spent all my time explaining that the body is nothing. You see what I mean? And of course, these are things that, again, uh, Vivekananda knew and tried to convey to his American devotees. Um, so, science, what we think of as science, is something true. One of the things about my book is to show how the vision of what science is changes very much over time. And I still think that we have perhaps an overinflated view of science as in its ability to explain the world. It can explain some aspects of the world, but not everything.
Yeah. Let me ask something else. Like, in your treatment of disciples of Swami Vivekananda, you have dealt with the Indians, the Americans, and the British. Now, my question is that, are their perception of Vivekananda those days was different? I mean, all these three people, and now when there is a lot of communication between places, and world is one village, as they call it,
Yeah,
and Swami Vivekananda is being read and all that. So are these three people, well, since I come from a place where we deal with a lot of young students, especially the youngsters, are they different? I mean, the American young man, and an Indian one, and a Brit.
absolutely. I mean, even though it is one village, in India, there are many people who view Vivekananda through the eyes of family tradition. And so it's bred in the bone. They get it in their families, and so they have a very intense relationship, a different relationship. When I wrote the book, I gave it to all different kinds of people. One was a Brahmo, and I couldn't believe it. He had a Brahmoist vision of Vivekananda. I gave it to a Punjabi who has returned to Hinduism, and she had a totally different view of Vivekananda. I gave it to a Bengali who had Ramakrishna in his family, but who had deserted it, but who felt still that Bengali kinship to Vivekananda. So in India today, and then of course we see what people do with Vivekananda. I mean, you can have people from the 1960s and 70s in Bengal who thought of Vivekananda as an inspiration for left-wing thought. There were those who thought of him as, you know, Nehru was I hope I'm right that Nehru was apparently there when they opened the Ramakrishna Institute in Calcutta. Then there are those now who claim him on the who are Hindu nationalists. Of course, everyone has a different view in India of Vivekananda, and in some ways, it's easy to do that because he dies at 39, so we don't know how he would have developed. So that's one thing. In America and in Britain, it's again different because they see Vivekananda as basically the door opener to all these Indian ideas. And I think he was the door opener. And what I'm trying to get them to understand, is that there's a background to why he comes to America and why he's again so savvy in understanding that Chicago is important, because America is not yet an imperial power. It will be in 1898, 5 years after the Parliament. But he's glad to be in America because he's speaking English, but he doesn't have to deal with the colonists. You know, he likes the fact that they're open and democratic in a way that he doesn't feel the British are. In Britain, people still have heard of Vivekananda, but interestingly, they don't think of him through an imperial lens. They think of him as the founder of yoga, really, which is very interesting. That's what many people who have heard of Vivekananda, but they don't realize that he has had such a powerful afterlife in Indian society.
Here is a question again from Brahmachari Vairagya Chaitanya, again another monk of Ramakrishna order, and let's have it. He says, having read Swami Vivekananda's exposition to Vedanta, the concept of self, Atman, and oneness, as a Westerner, how revolutionary it is for you to think of such ideas. Was it revolutionary?
Yes, it really was revolutionary. It really was. It was. But I also have to say that these high flights of Hindu metaphysical thought, what I loved about reading these things was the way he joined them to stories. And for me, for example, the stories of Radha Krishna, the stories of his relationship to Shiva when he's on pilgrimage, his discussion of not just the highest, but also the stories and how he uses parable. It's those two sides that I at first I only understood the parable side, and then with time I began to investigate the other side. And I think in a way, the reason why I spent so much time reading about the American women was that I was like the American women. I was reading Vivekananda and trying to understand. But also, because I've lived in Britain so long, I was like Margaret Noble. I understood, I was really like Margaret Noble, trying to understand.
And you have a Jewish descent.
Exactly. But that's the thing. It's also, the relationship between universalism and particularity. This is a very, very, very important issue for Jews as well, and also for many religions. And it's the way he thinks about that for me is much more important. And in one of your questions, you said, "What do you think is Vivekananda's contribution?" It's that he, what I was trying to do was think about the relationship of love and longing to spirituality and to ideas. This was my idea. And what I found interesting was that they connected, but sometimes the interactions were disappointing. It wasn't like they always understood one another. Nothing. That wasn't the case. But what they show is the attempt. And that's all we have. I mean, that is really all we have. I mean, we've grown up, and Vivekananda has been spoken about as a great cosmopolitan or a great globalist. But I think that after the pandemic, we realized that it's not so easy. We are a village on one level, but we're also fragmented, highly fragmented. There are
Highly fragmented.
boundaries, there are tensions, there are this. And basically, I was inspired by the example of trying to acknowledge it's not easy. And
Yes, as you said, the world is fragmented as well, although we are in a global village. And
exactly.
now, my favorite question that
Yes.
wanted to ask.
Yes.
In one of the reviewers says that Vivekananda was many things to the many people.
Yeah.
Ruth, why did you want to attribute the word guru to him?
Right.
And guru to the world, it means a lot.
Right.
I mean, what does it mean to you?
Okay. So it's very simple. What I was, of course, saying was he was trying to be a guru to the world. But I also was trying to explain that India was often placed in that position. But rather than it being easy to do that, it's also problematic because the idea that India is spiritual and the West is materialistic is basically a cliche. It's we all know that Indians are not purely spiritual and that Westerners are not purely materialistic. So while he enters into the Western world by presenting himself as a guru to the world, he's also constrained by these very categories that don't allow people to step outside the box. And I think that that's a great paradox for him. It was a great paradox for him. And I think if you don't mind my saying, because I'm not Indian, it remains a great paradox for India today, because India wants to be a world teacher, talks about itself sometimes as a world teacher, but it's not always true that people view it that way, or it's the case. Or do you see what I'm saying? It's a paradox, and I wanted to explore that paradox um, honestly and with generosity.
Then why not Sri Ramakrishna, guru to the world, but Vivekananda, guru to the world?
Because Ramakrishna is, certainly, you could be inspired anywhere by Ramakrishna, but Ramakrishna uh, lives and dies in 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 and around Dakshineshwar. It's not the same as a man who recognized that he had to get on the boat, that he had to go to visit the world, and he does. I mean, he just goes round, and he exhausts himself with the traveling as well. That he must be open, and to bring that back to India, but to bring India to the rest of the world. And that's why he is, in my view, a great global figure.
let's come to some of those processes. I mean, in the course of how long did it take for you to do this entire, I mean, to go through this entire journey? And in one place you wrote that the purpose of writing the book, it shifted from one phase to another,
It certainly did.
and that's why I call it a journey. So, journey in the real sense, have you visited India
Oh
while
yeah,
writing?
I did. I went to archives and I did everything. I also went all over America to look in
Uh-huh.
archives, and I did. I went to all these places, and as you see in the preface, I was in St. Louis, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Boston, New York. I went to all kinds of places. And I also, of course, went to Calcutta and Bellarmat, and I had to go to all these places. But there are many places that I wish I had been able to go to that I couldn't because
But
it's just
most of Vivekananda's writings were uh, 100 years ago. I mean, in the society was different, the places were different.
very
And why did you still wanted to visit those places rather than going through the books that were published during that time?
because if you don't have a sense of place, you can't understand. And also, when you go and visit people, they all give you bits of history. They give you their memories, they give you what has been passed down to them. You learn a lot. You really do learn a lot. And that's why, I mean, when I was a French historian, I tried not to go anywhere, not to talk about any place I hadn't been to. in this, really, in this place, in this book, that wasn't possible. But the fact is even though places change, they also have remnants of the past, and that's why um, you must go if you can. It's also very expensive, and I was very lucky that my college, All Souls in Oxford, they subsidized the travel, and without it,
Yes, wonderful, Ruth, to know all these facets of journey. Now, you in your book almost have you have mentioned that uh, Swami Vivekananda is somebody who has changed the way Americans think of spirituality and religion. Is it? And you also wrote that many people, when they think of India or eminent persons from India, they know Gandhi, they know Nehru, but probably they don't know Swami Vivekananda. Again, Vivekananda himself says, I want to be the voice without a form. Do you think, even though people don't know him as such, but probably his ideas and his philosophy, uh, his has her permeated through the life and society of America, and probably it has made an impact, although without knowing his name.
that was the
Does it
whole
make sense?
yes, that was the whole argument of the book, and that why he is effaced is complicated. He's effaced because he does not establish conventional churches because he doesn't want to. They create Vedanta societies, but that's different. And also, he knows he can't compete with the conventional churches, but he also says, I want you to be a better Methodist. I want you to be a better um, whatever. But he doesn't seek conversions. And of course, that is the reason why he's so appealing. And of course, this is an indirect and exemplary critique of missionaries in India. He's saying, look at what you do to us. And I come to you and I just tell you to be better in what you are. And it's that sense of the authentic self, that you must be yourself, that you must not rob people of their birthrights, that makes him so interesting. But of course, it means that he's not as well known because that's not what he sought to do. Yeah,
That's not what he sought to do.
that's right.
Yes,
But I
and
hope
then
that my book helps people to know who he is in the West. Let's hope.
yeah, in a way. And yes, that is so appropriate when I read these lines from your book. Although I will give space to Vivekananda's unvoiced assumptions. I understand that our listeners and viewers and many others will also have unvoiced assumptions about Swami Vivekananda.
Everyone does.
Anyways, what I wanted actually to utter is that you've written, I'm more interested in analyzing the tensions in his emotional world and the sometimes contradictory spiritual message that he constantly recalibrated for different individuals and public. We spoke about it a while ago, but I was thinking, do you think Vivekananda's tensions in his emotional world reflected the social milieu and his promotion of new synthesis grounded in Indian self belief in paying off now after a century? When India is being looked upon as a strong, culturally influential, and emerging major economy in the world? Or is it a myth?
Um, I'll tell you truthfully, I think that is what that's for Indians to decide. I mean, I really believe, but I also believe, of course, that, India, one of the reasons why I made the shift and did this work was it was so clear to me that India is the most populous nation in the world. It's demographically, when you go to India, if you come from the West, it's such a young population. We're so old. It's terrible. We're so old and gray haired. And also, there's such burgeoning life there. It's clear that there's a shift in global influence and global importance. And we just have to, that is, of course, true. Um, and there's no way of getting around it. It's India, China. There's just a different world. I'm 64, so I will tell you, it's already so different from when I was a young woman, in the 40 years. And
You're
also,
still young, Ruth.
but I also think it's really important to realize that when I was going to university, I would never have considered um, taking a course on Indian history. In Oxford now, that's unheard of. People would definitely take a course on Indian history, and they're concerned with India. But to be frank, they're not as concerned, in my view, as they should be. And that's again why I took this gamble to write. After all, academics are specialists, and it's very hard to step outside the confines of your specialism. But it was a gamble because I began to realize I no longer wanted to write um, in the old way. And that's why I made the shift.
Wonderful. There's a question here from Mr. Ajit Paul, who writes, it's a simple question to put to you. Uh, yeah, please show that. Do you think Swami Vivekananda's philosophy should be taught to school or college students for a better world tomorrow? Word tomorrow, I suppose he meant
Yes, that's
world. Uh,
um, I do you mean in the West? I don't know. I mean, I think it would be very interesting, in my view, to have some aspects of his work on universalism and diversity in the curriculum in our schools. I think that would be really interesting. And yeah, I do. I
yeah,
think
our
there will be
schools, as
surprises.
in the in UK, US,
Yeah,
India,
yeah.
all three.
Well, don't know about India. I mean, I again, um, there's no religious instruction in government schools in India, is there?
I mean, it's very difficult to say. It all depends
Exactly.
on,
How you
yeah,
do, how you regard it. Well,
and which school and what kind of schools. There's so
exactly.
much of variety everywhere.
Yeah.
So,
Whereas in America, what would it, or in Britain, it would be in courses on religious studies, because of course in England it's still an established church, so there is uh, teaching in Christianity, but there's also a lot of emphasis on religious studies, and even now they're starting to do courses on Hinduism.
mhm.
Um, so it's interesting. I have to say, some of the stuff that they do there, even I know it's incorrect. So there's still a long way to go, let me tell you.
There's still a long way to go. Um, I mean, here is another paragraph that is very dear to me, and I wish to read this from your book. That is, you wrote, for this reason, Vivekananda's writings provide little joy for the intellectual historian. He was no ordinary system maker, but rather adjusted his remarks for different publics during lectures and conversations. He constantly sought to respond and unapologetically found the spiritual absolute in what was relative and the rhetorical in what could be created between people in the human tirthas, what he encountered. So we spoke about some thing about it a while ago, but what I'm asking now is what possibly could have formed the underpinning Vivekananda's ability to deal with comparing and contrasting ideas of people. Uh, what was the strength? What was the base?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very moved that you chose that to tell me, because all those sentences were took a lot out of me to think about what he was doing. And yes, what I find so interesting about Indians is that so much of what, I mean, there, in my view, there are great political theorists in India. I mean, Gandhi was a great political theorist. Um, you could argue Tilak was a great political theorist. There's all kinds of ways you could, even if you don't agree with them. But
Mhm.
what's so interesting is they're riding on the hoof because they're involved. They're activists. They're not just political theorists. They're not philosophers sitting in an ivory tower in a university. Do you see what I mean? And that's, in a way, what Vivekananda did was exemplify karma yoga by engaging in the world and in these debates with people. And of course, he's always on the hoof. That's why he's comes up with all these extraordinary ideas. It's because he's seeking to communicate, that he is finding new avenues of thought, he's inventing, he's recollecting, he's scolding, he's encouraging. And that's a form of, it's extraordinary, isn't it? It's an extraordinary capacity. And I think he gets that because he is very, very clever. There's no doubt that he's clever. But he's also, this is something that he's learned through his long apprenticeship to Ramakrishna and through his engagement with his guru brothers, where and with his engagement with Western thought. He's reading constantly, and it's a constant conversation for him. Nothing is left. Nothing is written in stone. Everything is in flux and in this dynamic. And I think that you mustn't underestimate how much Ramakrishna kept on uh, engaging, encouraging him, resisting, teasing him, playing with him, and also scolding him, you know, and that he's already highly trained. And when he goes on his travels, which is what I do in, I think it's the third chapter, he also, when he goes down to Madras and he is also engaged in public debate. He is beginning to emerge as a public figure, though he doesn't see himself yet at all as the man who could get up at the World Parliament. But he does, because he doesn't want everyone else, especially the Westerners, to have the last word. It's as simple as that. And already in that space, he's creating, because he calls it Sisters and Brothers of America. He refuses to be an underling. He refuses to be subservient. And that's why that story is so told so often, because he's already inventing a new kind of Indian. He's created a new costume. He's, with the help of his Western female friends. Do you see what I'm saying? He's already trying to negotiate a path of presentation to the world that is not like a wandering sadhu, but nor is it like the minister or missionaries. He's trying to do something different, and he's not hiding. There is something really important to understand, that by wearing the orange turban and the scarlet coat, he is saying, I am here. I am here. And that's also very interesting. I mean, it's a hard thing to do, but he insists, and he has a certain ability that's better than the Japanese, for example, who also have a lot of disputes with the Americans in particular, but they can't speak English. They don't have that ability to communicate. And the English is a sign of his subservience. After all, he's a subject of the British Empire at this point. But it's also the entry into all these networks, both the global imperial one and the American one. So that's what I really think why he can do it. It takes him, he gets there. He has his own personal talents, but he's also schooled himself and been schooled by his experiences.
So, I mean, from your words, we can understand, and as we already know, that he is trying to impress. I mean, he actually is successful in impressing the intellectuals. And so is your book. The academics, the intellectual, all of them are really impressed by the way you have treated the subject.
Ah,
But again, as Swami Vivekananda wanted, and so you do, I
yeah,
understand from some of the words that you spoke just now, before a while, that it needs to be reached to the masses. It's a common people who has to grasp Vivekananda into their life, and he actually wanted, I come for the masses. And why he does speak to the kings and the academicians is probably because he thinks these are the people who would impress the rest of the world, the rest of the common folk, who probably are not gaining that much of prominence. Now my question is very simple,
yeah.
that how and what are the teachings of Vivekananda that can help a common man or common mass of people to to enrich their lives, to enhance their life? Because if one individual is, I mean, individuals make the mass. So this is my question: how can one individual, a common person, not expert in academics or so, can accept Vivekananda into his life?
Well, I would recommend reading Practical Vedanta, the lectures in London.
Okay.
And it's that it's the way he describes that there's nothing, everything can be in the service of the self that is God. And even the most humble things. And also that what is important is not moral absolutes, but for example, in the first lecture, he says something remarkable. He says, I know I shouldn't eat meat, which is fascinating, he says, but I do. But it doesn't mean that I'm a bad person, basically. I mean, he talks about eating meat almost in this in this place as a medicine, because you need to fight, you need to build strength. And he what he says to people is, don't focus on your transgressions. Um, Not that he believes in immorality, but don't focus on your transgressions. Focus on your possibilities, and then do it.
Positives.
Yes, but in a way that's practical.
Mhm.
And I think that idea of bringing, as I said, the mundane and the metaphysical together is a message. You wouldn't use the words mundane and metaphysical, but you could just say that's why he used the term practical. And of course, he's come from America. The lectures are being given in London, but he's come from America, where there's the dogma, the gospel of practicality. Where philosophical pragmatism is being developed by people like William James. How to the solving of real life issues, but he keeps intact the relationship of what is human and practical with what is broader and divine, cosmic, however you want to put it.
Yes,
And that's it.
exactly. Is it possible to separate the human and the mundane from the divine and the spiritual? Because there is this trend of thinking that I don't believe in God, I don't believe in religion, or humanity is my religion. That trend, and of course, people are confused at what actually means by humanity. For all those people who cannot think that deep, or who cannot probably take God as to be worshipped, I mean, for them, is there anything that can be taken from Swami Vivekananda? What will be your last message
Well,
for younger generation
I would say that
of America and India?
it's the notion of the divine spark within each human being that is important to understand. And that if you want to you cannot understand that yourselves are divine. That is his message, especially in America. And that's one of the things that they love the most about him, that he takes away the burden of sin and original sin. And he says, you are divine. Um, in the parliament, he actually says it's a sin to call you sinners.
So it's so wonderful, Professor Harris, to talk to you from both a personal point of view as well as from the point of view of an academician. I'm sure our viewers would love this, and indeed they would love to go to the book as well. But it was more enriching. I mean, or if not equally enriching, to read the book as well as to talk to you.
Thank
So
you so much. And someday, hopefully, I'll be able to come to the mountains. I've never been to the Himalayas. I would love to.
yeah, please come to Shillong, and let me remind our viewers as well as Professor Harris that we are speaking from a place where Swami Vivekananda delivered his last public lecture when he uh, first appeared publicly in Chicago. This was the place where he delivered his last public lecture. That's Shillong, and it's a beautiful place. And please visit Shillong. To all our viewers, and yes, Professor Harris, maybe we can see you one day and have a conversation, not online but one on one, sitting
Yes.
across the table
And
over a
thank
cup
you
of tea. Do
very
you like tea?
much. I love tea.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Uh,
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Namaskar.